evening, depending on where it is you're tuning in from in the world. We're delighted to kick off our seminar series and have a fantastic speaker in Dr. Lawrence Collett, whose expertise covers a whole gamut of things in clinical research methodology, and is a renowned expert in biostatistics. Her expertise covering methodology of cancer research, in particular studies that involve non-drug interventions, whether irradiation or surgery, quality assurance and studies in the field of urology, amongst others. Her research interests include, in statistics, range from development and use of biomarkers and imaging markers for the treatment selection and patient prognostic evaluation, to methodology of early phase studies using molecular targeted agents and innovative exploratory trial designs. Dr. Collett was previously worked at the EORTC for over 25 years as biostatistician and head of the statistics department, as well as being scientific development leader, and currently works for IDDI. Without further, there's an immense amount more I could say to sing the praises of Dr. Collett, but without taking up too much more of her valuable time and her speaking time, I'll hand over to you, Dr. Collett.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for those kind words. It's really my pleasure to be rejoining with the ESO, and in particular the ASAC group. So today I should be talking to you about non-randomized studies. So, and in particular some statistical concepts, but also more broadly of the methodology to use when you approach such studies. So I think in ESO you are all very much interested in surgery, and there is a large variety of research going on in this setting. One has to recognize that surgery is a complex intervention. I find it much more complex than drug studies, for example. And that very often we have to think of the trial in the perspective of not only the surgery itself, but also all the preoperative, postoperative care, and all characteristics of the patient, the surgeon, the team around the surgeon, and the ethics that sometimes limits the statistical, that puts some restrictions to the statistical methodology that can be used when one does research in this setting. So, but I think nevertheless, whatever study you will want to conduct, in general, what we are all after in research is some notion of causality, which factor is associated with which outcome. And I want here to just exemplify a situation where you see here a very nice and strong correlation between the per capita cheese consumption and the number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. It's a very strong association, but it doesn't mean it's causality. And I think one of the major problems that we see in the non-randomized trials, and in particular in retrospective studies, is this misinterpretation of associations, which is information that one factor informs about the other, that the two are related, and causality, which in addition has some directional relationship, that one factor is not only associated, but is also the cause of the change in the other factor. I think that that really is the fundamental problem. And a typical observational report, I want to illustrate some of the concerns that we will be discussing today. So if we take really the basic of the basics, which is the case series, so a description of what happened to a series of patients with a particular diagnosis, perhaps treated with a particular strategy, and then you find this nice publication in a single center series. Physicians report that 49 of their patients given a particular treatment for heart failure had a median survival of 37 months, for example. So in terms of information provided, it means that if you are comparable to the patients and get the same treatment for the same condition, you have 55% chance to survive 37 months or more, even though you have a large confidence interval around this value given the small sample. But more generally, I would question were these consecutive patients, is the group of patients already committed to this treatment representative of a larger population? What is the generalizability of this single center study in a small number of patients? What kind of comparative context can I find for interpreting this report at the light of the outcome that patients could have with an alternative treatment? So these are all the concerns that we will discuss today in reviewing the various types of designs that one may encounter. So another example of issues, and then I think I'll have covered most of the problems that are typical of this setting. For example, you find an association between surgery for hip fracture and a risk of mortality. And several observational cohort studies reported that a delay of surgery increases the risk of mortality in the patients with hip fracture. This is probably a true association, but other characteristics of the patient that result both in a delay of the surgery and at the same time in an increased frailty may act as confounders and inflate the apparent association between the putative causal factor and the putative outcome variable that would have been influenced by the surgery. So this typically, when you have a third factor of a set of third factors that are both associated with the causal factor and with the outcome factor, is a situation of confounding that leads to problems of interpretation of the results. So there are many other ways of, say, modifying your results or causing inflated association or deflated association that methodological problems, which we call biases. These are systematic distortions to the results. And I invite you to check this website where the biases and the various problems are really nicely explained and illustrated with discussions. So for us, I think we will focus on a limited number of problems that are the most often encountered. Selection bias, that is when the sample is not representative, or when you have lead time bias or attrition. Chance, of course, when you have small samples, you have variations that can give you wrong results. You may have measurement errors, for example, when you have informative missing data. Confounding, which we just explained, and reverse causation is sometimes also present when you do retrospective studies or when the temporality of the cause and the effect is not clear. So all these biases may say blur the interpretation of what you see. When you have a positive association seen or a positive correlation seen in your study, the associated biases may have caused this association. It may be a true association, it can be a chance association. Likewise, when you see no association, it may be that biases have eliminated the association that existed so that you don't see it, or maybe truly there is no association, or sometimes also there is lack of power to detect the association. So we have really to tune our interpretation of results at the light of all these biases. So we have methods to try to adjust for biases. For example, the most common bias in the observational analysis is known as the confounding bias, which we discussed earlier. Here is another example. We have patients with open versus laparoscopic appendectomy and an association with the postoperative wound infection rate. And we have here the results that show indeed in an adjusted analysis that patients with the open laparoscopy, open surgery have almost double the chance of postoperative wound infection. However, we have obesity playing as this confounder, and obesity is associated both with postoperative wound infection, with more infections in patients who are obese, and also with the propensity to use laparoscopic surgery, with less patients being offered laparoscopic surgery when they are obese. The way to adjust this analysis would be to look separately in the two groups of patients who are obese and patients who are not obese, to do the comparison, and you see that within each group, there is absolutely no difference between the two arms, and then get an overall result by combining the results in the patients with or without obesity. So in a way, to subgroup the analysis into subgroups where you can compare like with like, which is actually what we call adjustments of the analysis. So this adjusted analysis and adjustments, when you know which factor is a potential confounder, is the appropriate way to get a correct interpretation of the results. So no, there is no association, but actually once you take this confounding factor into account, you have the correct interpretation. Now, the best approach to eliminating biases, of course, these are randomized controlled trials. This is the closest you can get to comparing two groups that differ by one factor that you've assigned by randomization, and everything else is being equal. Of course, sometimes you cannot assign by randomization because maybe it's a feature of the patient that you want to study or a feature of the disease, and that cannot be randomized, or simply you cannot do it. So what we want to show now, we have explained grossly what the problems are. What I would like to discuss today is how to be aware of the possible biases, how to minimize them as much as possible, and also be aware of the limitations in the interpretation of the results when you are confronted to observational studies. I think first of all, we need to distinguish the case control retrospective studies from the cohort studies that can be generally prospective and where you analyze sometimes data that were prospectively collected, but you retrospectively analyze those data. So typically the cohort studies are the large registries. The randomized trials also form sorts of prospective studies. First, I want to discuss the retrospective case control studies. The difference between the two is that in a case control study, you will class the patients according to the outcome of interest, and you will look back for risk factors or exposure factors. In a cohort study, usually you first group the patients according to exposure to the risk, and you prospectively follow for the outcome of interest. Okay, so the temporality, here you group by outcome, and here you group by risk factor. So an example of a case control study, for example, here we have a paper that is relatively recent. So it's a risk assessment for distant metastases according to molecular profiling. So they took patients with differentiated thyroid cancer with metastases and patients without metastases, and then they looked back for their risk factors. And they analyzed the association between the risk factor and the risk of metastases. So the method that they used to adjust for potential confounders between this group and that group is a method that is called matching. And matching means that from the larger pool of patients without distant metastases, they will try to pick patients that are similar to the cases with distant metastases that they have identified. So originally, they identified 62 patients with metastases and 225 without. And you see that there are some differences in characteristics, notably the tumor size is larger in patients with distant mets, and the age is also different. What they now do is try to find for each patient, a patient with a similar tumor size and age, and they will restrict the analysis to the group of patients for which they could find a twin, if you wish. So here we end up with two groups of almost equal size. You see that the patient characteristics are now well balanced. You also note, however, that the characteristics of the resulting group are effectively similar to the group of patients with distant metastases, so not anymore of the larger population, and that has to be taken into account in the interpretation. And then they go on and they will compare the molecular characteristics of this group with this group that is similar in terms of two important prognostic factors. And that's actually what they did, and they found some genes were associated with the outcome. So when you do this kind of studies, what is important is that your cases and controls must be comparable with respect to the major risk factors. So you need to match or to find a way to adjust the analysis for those important confounders. Noting that when you match, for example, in this example by age and tumor size, you cannot anymore study this factor in your analysis. If you are using existing records, the challenge is that sometimes the records for the controls would be less complete, for example, or that you would have a retrospective series where a factor that is now known to be important to the outcome of interest would not have been collected at the time, and then your analysis is really limited. And sometimes when the exposure is more subtle and relies on the recall of the patients, you may have recall bias as well. You never can adjust for unknown confounders. That's something that only randomization can do. And in practice, when you do matching, you generally need a large pool of potential controls in order to find the good matches for your case. And the analysis that you do at the end will be in the group that is the common denominator to your cases and controls in terms of patient characteristics. So you have to be careful about that when you do your interpretation and reporting of your results. I think I have said that, so I will just go on and continue with the cohort studies. So this is the other group of studies, and that's something that we see more commonly, either because they're prospectively planned or because these come from a retrospective analysis of prospectively collected data. For example, when you do a retrospective review of existing charts that were collected in the hospital, the information was collected prospectively. So we distinguish for the cohort studies, so those where we first class the patient according to exposure. The retrospective cohorts, it's actually the retrospective analysis of prospectively collected data. Sometimes you have ambidirectional cohorts, so your study starts, you have some information that was already recorded and the rest is recorded prospectively. For example, if you study associations with smoking, the patient was already a smoker before, but he will also continue to smoke after. And you have prospective cohorts where you actually start your study and you prospectively plan it. You take the patients when they're exposed and you prospectively follow them to collect information about their outcome. This is typically what is done in interventional cohort studies, but you also have that in registries or surveys where you take all the patients that present with a certain condition. So an example, liver transplantation with grafts from super obese donors. So in this analysis, they wanted to study if the survival of patients who received grafts from donors that were, say, suboptimal, because they, again, I'm sorry if I picked examples based on BMI, but that's a very commonly studied factor. So in this case, they took 665 consecutive patients that were liver transplanted in their institution. They reviewed 468 cases, and they found 18 patients who received grafts from super obese donors, and they tried to find 2 matches for each donor. Again, this same method can be used. You will see in this report that they first wanted to match for this important parameter, but they couldn't do it. So they finally matched on age of the patient, age of the donor, and this factor. And you see that because of the small numbers, they also had to do some approximation. So when you see matching, remember that matching is often imperfect. It's not because one matches for age, then one matches exactly for age, and that each control is exactly the same age as the case. So some impact may remain. Another example here, it's typical risk factors. So here, participants undergoing lumbar surgery were recruited between April and November 2016. It's a prospective cohort. They prospectively collected information about physical function, back pain, leg pain severity, which was measured at entry and 6 months post-operatively. And so this is exactly an example of prospective cohort where we don't have intervention, no randomization or no experimental intervention, just observation. And in this case, they used a different method for adjustment, which is done by statistical adjustment using logistic regression model. So actually we have a number of methods, and I will run through those to do the adjustment. What is important to mind is that when you set up retrospective cohorts, you have the same problems as case control studies. That is, you have to do with the data that is available, and that can be inaccurate. There can be changes over time in the definition of stage, for example, or in the kind of staging imaging that was done. The data completeness may be problematic. You may have a lot of missing data that would skew your analysis. In that respect, large consecutive series, so registries or patient records, are the best source of information. And also, when you have done the matching, you need to mind the representativeness and the generalizability of the results. When you prospectively plan your observational study, you have more opportunities to collect all the information that is needed to make your adjustment. So you can prospectively think of all the factors that might be associated with both your outcome and your propensity for the procedure. And you can use a number of methods to adjust for the confounding factors. And I have here a list of the methods that could be used. Of course, randomization is the best, but you will hear that about from Catherine Forpier next at the next session. You could match, and we have discussed already the limitation of that. You can stratify the analysis. That's what we did in the first example with the obesity. And two methods that I haven't discussed yet, I will now discuss the second one. So multivariate regression models. If you have many factors, like in a prognostic risk model development, you want to adjust for all of them together. The best is then to use a model to do that. Obviously, you will only adjust for the known confounders. That's the same for all the methods except for randomized trials. And if you have a large number of covariates, you will need a large sample size. So you need to mind the power and the precision. And for that, you may need to have a larger sample size than if you do simple stratification for one or two factors. And then you can also use a different form of matching if you have a lot of factors, which is, instead of matching for each factor individually, to create a model that will incorporate all the factors into a score and match the patients according to this score. So I have here an example of what propensity score matching means. So in this example, we have an association of surgical intervention for adhesive small bowel obstruction with a risk of recurrence. So it's a classic longitudinal study with the aim to evaluate if the type of surgery so in the type of management would influence the outcome. And so the way to do that is that they have first analyzed the data to associate, to find a risk factor that predicts whether the patients will have operative or non-operative management. After that, they have matched the patients according to the propensity score and conducted the analysis on the matched set, or alternatively, one can calculate the propensity score and adjust the analysis by the propensity score itself. Here, one needs to have help of a statistician to find the appropriate form of modeling of the propensity score, but that can be done. So that's actually what propensity score matching means, is that you will make a model that accounts for the prognostic factors to predict the intervention. Once you have that score, you equilibrate the two groups for that score, and you study in the adjusted group the association between the intervention and the outcome. Again, only randomization can do the best, but that's not what we are discussing today. So far, I have discussed only prospective non-interventional cohorts, where you do the analysis of patients that were treated, followed, or observed per standard practice. You can also use prospective cohorts to study an intervention that you impose, but without randomization. So basically, this is a phase 2 single-arm trial or a feasibility study, where you prospectively define objectives and primary endpoint, but you benchmark your comparison not to randomized data, but to historical data. I would say that because of the reliance to historical data, everything that I said about biases and temporal changes still applies. So if you compare to an historical benchmark, if overall the outcome of the patient population has increased between the time when you collected the historical data and the time when you run your analysis, your historical benchmark will be potentially too low, for example. The risk of biases in building your historical data are exactly the same as the risks that I explained before when you do non-randomized comparison. So I think the most useful use of such single-arm phase 2 studies is really when the benchmark is no failure or all failures. So if you want to do a non-inferiority study and evaluate if decreasing the intensity of a follow-up of patients who normally with the current intensity of follow-up have no relapse that cannot be salvaged, for example, so they have a perfect survival in relation to the disease. Your benchmark is there are no failures and I will decrease the treatment and see if I still have no failures. Or if you have a new treatment for a condition where there is no existing treatment, then your benchmark is 0. And it's easy to evaluate if your results are better or worse. So an example here of a single-arm study. So it was evaluation of the safety of Duracillin patch for reduction of cerebrospinal fluid leakage following elective cranial surgery. So in this case, they have conducted an open-label single-arm multi-center study. They have enrolled 40 patients, and their primary endpoint is a combination of postoperative events. And they have designed their study with a predefined success condition, just as in a regular clinical trial, where they said that not more than 3 patients would meet the primary endpoint, so that there would be no less than 3 patients with problems among the 40 patients. Their baseline is that the leakage occurs in this rate of patients. So if we look a little bit closer to the design of this study, what they did is effectively that you can you set a lower bar for the success and you calculate the power for a higher bar of success. So for example, if you would say, sorry, here I'm displaying this for a success criteria, which would be absence of toxicity. For example, if you would assume that there should be no more than 30% of patients without toxicity. Sorry, I do it again. If you need to show that you have more than 30% of patients with a success, you will have a successful study when your confidence interval excludes this bar. And a typical phase 2 sample size will calculate the sample size needed under a certain assumption for your true success rate. So in general, you will end up with 2 numbers for your sample size. One will be the number of patients needed. In their case, it was 40. And the number of successes that you need. So in their case, they needed to have 37 patients out of 40 without problems. And that's the kind of calculation that they probably did. They took P0 that was very low, 20%. And then they wanted to show that they would increase the rate of success to 40 patients. And they ended up with this kind of sample size calculation. You can find a number of options for sample size calculations, including Bayesian designs. They're very easy to calculate. You generally need to specify what is the benchmark you want to exclude and what is the benchmark that you would want to reach with a certain power and a certain type 1 error. And those calculators will give you the number of patients that is needed. The problem in those designs is that they are heavily rooted in your baseline assumption. So if you want to, say, demonstrate that your study has a success rate of greater than 20%, because that's what you know from historical control, but for some reason your patient group is selected to have better patients, you will be inclined to see better results than in your historical series, and you will have an increased risk of false positive study results, which maybe is good for publication, but is not good for science. If you take p-naught too high, so if your former studies were in patient group that had some selection bias, you may then increase your risk of false negatives because your expectations will, for the experimental arm, will be effectively not met. So it's very important to have this benchmark P0 set appropriately for similar patients. So the best way to plan your study is generally to define your research objective upfront, to have one or few questions, be it observational or interventional. One study cannot do everything. You need really to identify the population of interest in your study and make sure that you get a representative sample. You need to precisely define your endpoints, specify what is your primary endpoint and how it's assessed. Identify the potential confounders and the risk factors. I suggest you do a literature review. Select the most adequate and feasible design. So for example, you can restrict your population of interest. For example, if you want to exclude the factor BMI from the association studies, you could restrict your population to patients with a normal BMI and do a separate study for patients with higher BMI. And which factors will be adjusted for by statistical methods. So which factors do not select patients for your study, but all the patients are included in your study and you adjust for them. You need to identify also the data items that you need to collect. And this needs to be comprehensive, but not exhaustive. The more you ask when you do a prospective data collection, the more missing data you get in general. So it's best to really focus on what you need, but then not to exhaust the participants with a too exhaustive data request. Write a protocol and a statistical analysis plan. I think this is true even if you do an observational study. So in surgery, you must not only assess the outcomes of the procedure, but oftentimes some of the factors that characterize the process will also be relevant. But again, you don't need to have case report forms that would be as exhaustive as patient records as you find them in the hospital. So in terms of database, a database is not a patient file, so you need to keep it short and simple and complete in preference. When you do a study that involves surgery, especially if you're studying a new intervention, I think it's important to select also the participants so that they have finished their learning curve. So you may have accreditation before sites can participate in the study, or you need to record the information about experience in order to adjust for this. When you compare different methods of surgery, be mindful that the surgeon is different from the center. So you need to have equal experience in the same center for different surgeons and try to keep all the other conditions of the surgery as similar as possible. So if you can control by protocol or provide guidelines for the perioperative management or preoperative treatment, it is important to record that as well, but again, in a relatively concise manner. Ideally, if you're studying and comparing interventions, if you don't randomize, because it may not be possible and it may not be possible to blind, sometimes you can find ways of increasing the strength of your study by having, for example, a blinded adjudication committee of the outcome that is often used when the outcome is assessed based on imaging, for example, where you would have an imager not knowledgeable of the kind of procedure that was performed, who would evaluate the outcome. Sometimes when it's a more subjective outcome, you could have someone not involved in the treatment of the patient to interview the patient so that the data are not influenced. I think what is important also is to record the dropouts. And oftentimes when studies involve surgery, there will be patients who will not undergo the surgery or in whom the resection was not performed. So there is often a temptation to exclude those patients from the analysis, but then be mindful that your report will be really about patients who could have the procedure of interest. So they will not be generalizable to an intention to treat interpretation. But if you do include all patients in the analysis, you may have to adjust your expectations to the fact that a proportion of patients will not receive the intervention. You can also take active measures to prevent missing data. And I have here an example that was a trial of beta blockers in patients undergoing non-cardiac surgery, and their endpoint was the risk of major cardiovascular events at 30 days post-operatively. First, they had central review, and they also had monitoring of all parameters that were suggestive that the patient might have had or be at risk for cardiovascular events. And based on those, they would query the centers to collect the information about those cardiovascular events. So they centrally monitored the compliance, and they offered alternative treatment and administration routes when the oral intake was not feasible. So these are examples, they're not always applicable, but examples of methods that can be implemented in a prospective protocol to try to reduce the amount of missing data and try to improve adherence and to reduce the number of dropouts. Sometimes you can be also creative, and sometimes you may not randomize the patients to one or the other procedure, but there may be some questions that would be amenable to having both interventions, in which case you could randomize the patients to the sequence in which the intervention is given. For example, if you compare again two different imaging methods, you could have a period or two different managements. You could have a period when you give the first intervention and a second period when you give the second, and you could compare the patient with his own results under one observation or the other, which is called a crossover design. And for some questions, you may also envisage not to randomize the patients, but to randomize the centers, for example, to change the management in the center and to do period effects within the same center. So if you want to compare, for example, different ways of managing patients, you could have 3 months the site performs in a certain way, and the next 3 months the site performs in a different way, and you analyze the results within center by comparing the two periods. When you report your study, even if it's an observational study, you also need to be mindful of reporting guidelines. And I'm here giving you a link to this website where you will find absolutely all guidelines about reporting of studies. And you see that for observational studies, there are the STROBE guidelines. There are also extensions for a number of specific type of studies. On that website, you also have in the toolkit a number of documents that are aimed to facilitate the review of such studies. And I think it's always useful to read those reviews and to read the guidance, because they will give you insights that may be useful for you at the time of planning your study. So in conclusion, if you do prospective studies, be it, observational studies, I would say first mind the anecdote, make your study matter. So does it matter to report practice outcomes in a small number of ad hoc selected centers? So try to think of what your study will tell to the reader when it will be published. Prospectively plan the study, even if it's a retrospective analysis, try to think ahead how you will do your analysis. Maybe set your goals and define your terms of success. Even in that case, what is a meaningful association if you're looking for an association? Randomize when it is possible, but when it is not possible, consider blinding, matching, and adjustments. Plan those methods prospectively. Try also to think of your study in terms of the power that you have to detect a certain association. Chase the missing data, but collect only the focused information that you need. Monitor your study. I think it's important, specifically for missing data, and if it's a prospective study, for safety. And report your study by applicable guidelines, in which case it is most often the STROBE guidelines for the type of study that you're conducting. I give you here a number of publications, if it is of interest to you. You will find more examples in those publications. So with this, I would like to give the floor to the leaders.
Thank you very much again, Dr. That was a fantastic chat and overview. Just I'm sure so any of the participants and attendees attending, you can use the chat to enter questions, and we here, the panelists, will filter through some of your questions, and we can help ask some of them and answer some of them too in the chat if we don't have time. But just whilst people are entering questions, Dr. Klett, I hope you don't mind me asking, just to go back, you mentioned on one of your earlier slides about accounting for associations or findings from studies. And you mentioned if no association was found, one possibility is that the study wasn't powered correctly. Do you have, I suppose, how would you advise people to think about, you know, if they've come to the point where they've found there's no association, and perhaps, you know, the value of doing a post hoc power analysis on their data and how valuable that is, or what limitations there are?
Yeah, I think it's always interesting to evaluate the post hoc power, or on the reverse, to, you know, to evaluate what magnitude of effect this study could have detected given the sample size at hand. There are some rules of thumb, of course, but I think with the calculators that I gave, it's pretty easy to evaluate that. It's true that oftentimes no association is found, and people are tempted to conclude that there is no association. But of course, you may miss it because you have too few patients. But you may also not see it because there would be biases at play that counteract the effect that you want to see. So I think it's really important when you read a publication to also keep all those elements in mind. Was there selection? Are the two groups comparable? Was there appropriate adjustment for potential confounders? Is the power sufficient to detect the results and most importantly, is this study generalizable to the conditions and the setting where I am currently? Because oftentimes, especially with direct matching, you end up with a population that is very, very selected. In retrospective studies as well, it is never intention to treat. It's always people who have had the intervention and the outcome. So that's sometimes maybe misleading if you're thinking for yourself in an intention, prospective intention to treat manner. So generally, the smaller the sample size, I would say that the higher the risk also of random high. So there is strong, extremely strong results seen in a selected subgroup, because the smaller sample makes it more prone to random fluctuation.
Laurence, there is a question from the chat, and the question is a sample size calculation needed even for an observational prospective study?
So it is not mandated, but in general, I would think that it is important to have a clue of the size of the effect that your study might be able to detect. So of course, if you know what you're after, if you're making an observational study and you know what is the outcome of interest, what is the rate that you see, what is also the prevalence of the two groups of your risk factor of interest, you can run some scenario to say, well, if I had a prognostic factor that would be distributed 20% versus 80% or 50%, 50%. And if I have a binary outcome and I want to detect a odds ratio of 1.5, what kind of sample size would I need to have? Just to give an impression. I don't think we need exact sample sizes, and like for, say, clinical trials in general, but I think it is still relevant to know approximately, you know, what your study is able to detect in terms of effects. Or alternatively, post-hoc. But if you plan it as a cost, so it's important to see also, will you be able to accumulate enough data to make it relevant? And if not, can you maybe join forces with someone else to get enough patients?
Thank you so much for the great lecture. We are receiving a lot of several feedback here of how they appreciate so much this lecture, which is very, you know, dedicated for surgeons. Maybe I can ask, when it comes to starting a study, what would be your advice for surgeons? How to define their endpoint? And how early should they be consulting as a statistician when they're thinking of an observational study?
I think it's difficult to give an answer in general for all kinds of questions, because you can have questions for the anesthetics that you give, you can have comparison of surgery. So maybe if you could frame a little bit the kind of question that you would be studying. I think, because I think it's always best to have a discussion, at least a chat, with a methodologist who is aware of the potential biases, ideally one that is a little bit acquainted to the life in a hospital, so that can understand your language and who can understand the subtleties of surgery, or maybe a colleague surgeon who has followed some statistical methods course. Because I think what is important is to define what is the starting point. When do you capture your patients? When do you capture the intervention? When do you capture the outcome? So when is the starting point of my study in relation to those points? And to evaluate if you can get a non-selected group, so if you can get a representative group, or if you will de facto miss some patients in your sample. I think I also saw, I think we discussed a lot when we were at EORTC, prospective surveys of procedures that exist in, that are used in some centers. I think there the crucial point is not really power, but really the representativeness of the pool of sites. Because oftentimes the descriptive observational study where you want to say pattern of usage of this kind of procedure or pattern of usage of some post-operative approaches. It's tempting to do it in your country. It's tempting to do it among your friends. But it's, I mean, you need to specify what you want to talk about. That's the very first thing. What is my question? And what is the characteristic of the real world that I want to describe? So is it patients in university hospitals in Northern Europe? Is it patients that were pre-selected and fit for a certain type of surgery? Is it yeah, if you compare surgical versus non-surgical interventions, for example, you may easily get selection bias, which is patients would be selected out of the surgical intervention for some factors related to their probable outcome, in particular to death or risk of relapse. So you have to think about it. I think my best guidance is always, as a statistician, I always, first, what is your question? And next, imagine you collect your data in this way. Imagine you run your analysis. Imagine your results. What does it mean? What could go wrong? And it's how you build a proper, a good program is by thinking ahead of time how you would interpret your results if you get them the way you think of going.
There's another question from the chat, and the question is, should it be regular practice to involve a statistician since the early phases of protocol development? And I guess
yes.
The answer is yes, but there are not enough statisticians probably.
Yeah, I don't know how it's set up in the hospitals. If you're in a university hospital, generally there would be some statisticians available for advice. I think the first discussion doesn't need to be wouldn't take long to a statistician if the statistician understands your language and your circumstances. I think that's the bigger difficulty is that the statistician may not appreciate all the intricacies of your particular specialty. But aside of that, the general principles are principles that a statistician can guide you with. And it can be an epidemiologist as well. Huh? It doesn't need to be a biostatistician. It can be anyone who is acquainted with those types of analyses, so association studies. So you can go chase in a wider range.
So I have a question myself, if I may. So what is very often used in non-randomized trials in surgery is multivariable regression. Mm-hmm. And then from how I perceive it, there is really no consensus, even among statisticians, in how you select the variables and whether or not it's necessary to first do like a bivariate correlation and then select only the ones that have a p-value of 10% or 20%. And It's sometimes stated that you don't really need to do that bivariate and just immediately build a multivariate model. And then how do you enter the variables all at once or one by one? What's your advice?
I have two recommendations for this. There is often a temptation to enter in the model about everything that was collected. And I don't think that's useful. You really need to have a good reason to enter a factor in a model. And in this case, it should be that it's either associated to your exposure or to your outcome, so that it's a relevant factor. If it's an irrelevant factor, for which you have no medical or biological rationale, I wouldn't enter it. Next, when you do a multivariate model, the more factor you enter, the more data you need. So it's impossible. So it's not an exact rule, but keep it as a rule of thumb. If you have a binary outcome variable, take the group with the smallest number, be it positive or negative, and divide by 10. That's about the number of factors, binary factors, that you can enter into your model. For time to event, it's the same, but with the number of events, right? So oftentimes you have too many. That's why I say first, select them. Next, I would in general not recommend to go for a univariate analysis if you do a multivariate analysis. And I would generally prefer to enter all the factors rather than start by one. The reason is that factors might be correlated. You may enter one, enter the other. None of them is significant, and the two together would be significant, for example. That happens, and even more so in medical circumstances. So I would say backwards rather than forward in general. And now whether to remove factors or not, I would think that if you had a good reason to think that the factor might play, why remove it? So that's a little bit of a change of paradigm. But I'm tempted to use all the factors that are meaningful. Now, if you have too many factors, then you do need a statistician indeed, because you would need to do that to enter all the variables at once. You would need to use sophisticated methods such as lasso, or methods that enable you to enter more factors than you can buy. So that constrains analysis. But I think oftentimes there are too many factors. Or you're looking for genomic things, and then it's a completely different business. I mean, then you need to use totally different methods because of the number of associations that you can seek. So. I don't know if that's the answer to the question.
Go on ahead, Wim.
Yeah, I was just about to say that I don't see any more questions from the chat, but maybe we can give people a chance to...
I think there's maybe one more comment in the chat. I'm not sure if you've seen.
Yeah, it says randomized clinical trial remain unfortunately the gold standard for many health agency and funders. However, in surgery area, observational study consolidated by a robust statistical framework like propensity score is a good alternative to give real life answer to targeted objective. Yeah, I think when you can actually not get randomized evidence, the best is to use appropriate adjustment. Now, propensity score will adjust for confounding for the factors that are known, that were collected. So I think what is important is to make sure that all the relevant factors are available for the propensity score analysis. So if you miss an important predictor, it will not work. That's the same if you want to create a new prognostic model, but you miss the one important factor that an earlier trial found, just don't do it. It's useless. And what it doesn't cover either is selection bias. So make sure that your study is free of pre-selection of patients or selection bias between one arm and so that your sample is representative. And by the way, in very rare cancers, nowadays the agency is opening up to the use of real-world evidence for label extensions as well. I'm not saying it's necessarily a good thing, because when randomization can be done, it should be done. But indeed, when it cannot be done, then we have to find other ways. Yeah. So I'm not dogmatic anymore. Too old for that.
Well, Dr. Collette, thank you so much for your time and this wonderful masterclass of a seminar, and thank all of our attendees for joining. And so on behalf of ESO, ESAC, and the Research Academy, thank you, Dr. Collette, and thank all of you for attending. And
thank you all.
Invite everyone to join us again next week at the same time for the next webinar in our series.